get this old YouTube dude going. I'm just happy to have other people on the podcast. I've been talking to myself for 2 weeks now. Dumbass. Oh.
Lex G podcast style.
Honestly, it's like I don't know how those drive time people do it, where they just sit there, like either like sports radio or like something like that, where they just sit there and talk by themselves and answer calls. I'm just like, Jesus, like there has to be like a degree of narcissism to just sit there and like listen to yourself talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours.
Yeah.
You should start a hotline,
We should have added that.
in.
Yeah, because I could have used that. I'm, after a while, I'm just talking around in circles.
Yeah.
All right.
Hitting my record button.
All right. Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. And welcome to episode 370 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Nadine Smith.
Eitan Weisvogel.
In today's episode, we'll be talking about movies that we saw this week in part 1, including a little bit of wrestling. And in part 2, we'll be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1988's Crossing Delancey. Head over to cinematary.com on Monday after this episode comes out. We'll have some TIFF 2021 coverage, mainly from myself, a little bit from Andrew Swafford, who watched some stuff on the Digital Pro system. But yeah, we'll have all that good stuff on cinematary.com as we recap the festival, which was a good festival. It's got a little bit weird with the whole COVID thing, but I don't know. They let me back in the country. They let me leave Canada and come back to the United States. So that's good, I guess. Well, let's go ahead and jump into movies that we saw this week. And Eitan, I'm going to kick it off with you. You caught the new Clint Eastwood movie, which is the Talk of the Town over on HBO Max.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Cry Macho.
Yeah, so I did see it on HBO Max and not in theaters, though I hear it does look pretty good, as you might imagine. First 30 minutes are pretty rough, I will say. But once it gets into kind of the meat of the movie, which is, he picks up this kid and is taking him across the border from Mexico to Texas. It's very, I feel like it doesn't come with a lot of like the baggage of some of the more recent Eastwood movies, which are kind of like just, like a kind of Schrodinger's cat of politics. You can choose to read it as being left-wing or right-wing. Cry Macho doesn't really have any of that. It's just kind of an old man bonding with a younger guy, and yeah, it plays to his strengths, and the photography is really beautiful, and Clint Eastwood is Clint Eastwood. So yeah,
I've seen people kind of talking about this where between like this and I think the other one they mentioned is like Gran Torino, and I forgot the third one, but they talk about like he's been doing these like swan song films for a while now.
Yeah,
I guess like in terms of that, like qualifying it as that, even if you see whether you see that or not, how does this kind of work as one of these kind of late period Clint Eastwood swan song movies?
Yeah, I haven't seen Gran Torino in years, but The Mule I think is the other one.
The Mule, yeah.
I think it's a little. I don't think that there's as much parallel with his real life. In The Mule, there was kind of stuff involving his wife in that movie that felt kind of like related to his relationship with Sandra Locke. And this one, his wife and son that died in an accident years before, which isn't really close to anything in his life. It feels like he's definitely playing with his image a little bit, and playing with kind of the image of the macho cowboy. But I think overall it's if this is a send off, it's a very kind of gentle nice way to end things in his career. Just kind of about an older guy who's been through it and is just looking for some kind of peace at the end of his life.
Mhm.
So yeah, definitely not as it doesn't have the thing that The Mule does, where it feels very like he's trying to apologize for his real life whatever mistakes. So yeah, I overall I like this probably the most out of any of those
Mhm.
movies, and definitely the most of his recent work, which I know some of them have their champions, but yeah.
Yeah. Nadine, I know you haven't seen this one yet, but as a Clint, especially a late period, I feel like Clint fan, what do you, I guess, what are you looking forward to with Cry Macho compared to other recent Clint Eastwood movies?
I mean, I think it is sort of nice for him to visit some material that doesn't quite have a lot of the baggage that's been wrapped up in some of his recent movies.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it maybe is reminiscent a little bit like to the Mule, just in having a border crossing involved in the narrative, but obviously like that movie involves like drugs and cartels and like I think doesn't really like give in to a lot of those stereotypes that we're like very used to seeing from that sort of action thriller, like south of the border kind of genre, like Sicario or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it definitely kind of, I don't know. I mean, he has a tendency to,
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
definitely like The Mule is like a culture clash type of movie with like
yeah,
an older white guy you would assume would be um, racist, kind of coming to learn more about these Mexican uh, drug smugglers, and they end up becoming friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Cry Macho, I mean, definitely there are a lot of comments made about him being a gringo, but there's not really that. It takes place in 1979, so it doesn't have the kind of like political,
Yeah.
relevant angle to it. Um, and yeah, it just kind of avoids that entirely.
That's it. I didn't realize it was, I mean, period, but it was like a period piece. It wasn't current. I thought it was more related to like, I thought it was, set in the present. I didn't realize it was set, in the
No,
past.
yeah. Well, I think because he had been trying to adapt this novel for a while and was, I think, going to make it in either the 80s or maybe the early 90s,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And it does feel like the material has changed not a lot. Like you could see this being a movie he would have made, pre Unforgiven or something.
mm,
Mm-hmm.
But just it has him as a 90-year-old in it instead of as like a whatever he would have been then, 50-year-old. I don't know
Yeah.
if that was math was correct.
just old. I mean, he's always been old.
Yeah.
He's been kind of old for a while. Um, I, I've been more mixed on like the late period Clint movies. But with this one seems a little bit more interesting. I mean, from what you're saying, it seems like it's kind of engaging with some kind of, it's engaging with kind of his past in a way that's kind of interesting. I mean, for those who are, I think that there's a large contingency of people who are uh who are interested in like this late period of Clint Eastwood's career. I mean, I guess what is interesting about him as a director, still kind of cranking these movies out, and especially these movies where he kind of puts himself in the lead and is engaging with, somewhat of a kind of through line between what he's done in the past with like, his spaghetti westerns and like you mentioned, Unforgiven and things like that, and something like this or The Mule or, um, you know, a lot of his recent stuff where it seems like he's kind of in conversation with that a little bit. I mean, what's I guess what are people on that level? What's kind of interesting about the Cry Macho?
Yeah, I mean, I think with his late period, I think what a lot of people respond to is just that um, he has a certain brand that allows him to make movies that um, I think you just typically wouldn't see in the marketplace anymore, really. Movies that have a lot of, I don't know, breathing room, maybe, like scenes that don't necessarily, there's not necessarily that kind of narrative drive.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Cry Macho is just, their car breaks down and they get stuck in this town, and they're spending a lot of time there and meeting villagers and riding horses and taking care of animals. Because it has Clint Eastwood in the lead, Warner Brothers and HBO Max is going to release this and give it a lot of press. It's kind of almost he's kind of almost sneaking neo-realist isn't the right term, but there's like kind of a realism and a type of realism that you don't really see in American movies anymore. I know a lot of people, I don't love 1517 to Paris. A lot of people talked about that film as being kind of this weird documentary fiction hybrid. But I think all of his movies, they feel very tied to the people and the places that they're filming, and
Yeah. I mean, I think that people with that concept that you were talking about, Eitan, of like there's a sense of breathing room, I feel like people respond to his movies a lot, or at least the later ones, like cinephiles do, just because there are a lot of things that feel almost accidental, or that feel like, I don't know, these kind of loose ends. Like, and I think that sometimes like people really respond to that who are really like invested in film in a certain way, because it's, I mean, I guess that's like the definition of auteurism, is like these kind of stray touches that sort of really let you know who the artist is, as opposed to this like really like structured, cohesive kind of package of a movie. Like these movies in a lot of ways, like, and it's like, I feel like my mileage definitely varies with stuff like 1517 to Paris and The Mule, just because those movies are very like moment to moment, and things that people respond to them about on film Twitter almost a lot of times feel like these moments that are like designed almost in a way to be memed. Like they're just all these weird details in like The Mule, of like him having multiple threesomes, or like the scene where he interacts with like the lesbian biker gang, or in like 1517 to Paris, like these dudes are walking around eating gelato, and the whole like tiny sodas thing, and like these just, it's just guys hanging out for a lot of that movie. And then the parts of the movie where it's like, the flashbacks in the past, it's very like, for lack of a better word, it's clunky. And I mean, I think some people think it's bad, and some people are like, oh, this is interesting because there's just a like, I don't know, I guess there's like because he's Clint Eastwood, there's like a lack of oversight. And so some people I think maybe think that that's a bad thing, and ends up in resulting in stuff like American Sniper, with the like fake baby that everybody makes fun of, where it's like he's this old guy himself, but he's also such a brand that there's maybe like a level of like quality control, that's like not the same as, it's obviously like very different than like a Marvel movie or something, where they're gonna like every detail is going to be really like fastidiously planned and thought out. And a lot of these, I think Clint Eastwood's movies, especially because they're so fast and he's old, they're like they feel very on the fly. They feel very like you said, breathing, open-ended, kind of improvised almost, and just looser. And so I think because of that, people are always, there's like an unpredictability almost. And I think sometimes with that, there's maybe a sort of like edgy response where it's like, oh, is he gonna like be problematic and regressive, or is he going to like subvert our expectations and like maybe it won't be this like horrible conservative diatribe, maybe there will be some subtext or nuance there. And so I think with that too, people are interested because it's like you don't really know what you're going to get. You don't really know if you're going to be offended or if you're going to be like, oh, that was different than I expected, you know, that was had a little bit more to say.
Yeah, well, you think about just how a lot of big movies, especially studio movies, are so workshopped, you know, like because they're just gone. They go through so many ringers of like, does it connect to this? Does it, you know, do this? Like in the way that Clint Eastwood shoots, where it's just he does the one take and it's like let's move. I think that also plays the, you know, kind of what you're talking about of like there is just this if anything it's more like true improv than the kind of how they try to improv stuff in other modern big movies, because even that improv work is still very structured and very workshop to a degree. And this one, I mean, just the way I was listening to an interview that Matt Damon did, and he's talking about working on Invictus, and he was talking about how he was very stressed out because like he had to do this South African accent, and he's like, Clint Eastwood doesn't, you know, give you a gazillion takes to like get the accent down. So it was like there was almost like this imperfection to it because he's like, I'm having to like nail it on the first try. And I think that's just kind of part of you know, his movies.
Yeah.
Well, Cry Macho, it's on HBO Max or it's in theaters if you want to go check it out there. Speaking of Matt Damon and kind of Clint adjacent movies, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Stillwater, which I've heard mixed things on. I've heard some people who kind of dismissed it, but I've also heard people who really liked it, and it's seeming kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the liking it category, and I actually think it is another movie that feels weirdly like it's very loose and you know, this it's based on the Amanda Knox case pretty clearly, even though it's not, you know, the characters aren't exactly the same. It's more about like, you know, they're from Oklahoma versus I think Amanda Knox was from Seattle, and they're in France instead of Italy. But yeah, it kind of takes that story and goes a completely different direction with it than you would expect. And kind of all of the, I don't know, issues that you think that the Amanda Knox case raised, it's not what the movie is exploring at all. And so instead of being a movie about, you know, being railroaded by, you know, an unfair criminal justice system, it kind of becomes a movie just about how Americans are viewed in other places in the world, and kind of the inherent like privilege of being an American, even when you're, you know, middle or lower class, or you think of yourself as middle or lower class. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the movie is just Matt Damon living with this French single mother and her daughter and just bonding with them. Those scenes felt very Eastwood to me. Just like you almost like forget the thriller aspect of it. And it just kind of weirdly goes between being like a, you know, a thriller and just a, you know, kind of independent drama. You know, something that you might have seen, like, I mean, it's Tom McCarthy directed, and you know, it feels almost like some of his early work before he did Spotlight and that Adam Sandler movie.
I was gonna say Tom McCarthy, director of The Cobbler.
Yes. And yeah, it just took me by surprise, really. And I don't want to spoil it, but the late in the movie twist it's a really ballsy move, and I just have to respect it because you know, playing around with a real life case and changing some of the details of it you know, it made some people mad, including, I believe, Amanda Knox. And, you know, I'm not saying that that's good or bad, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I just, it took me by surprise, and, you know, it's an interesting decision is all I'll say.
You know, I think it's I haven't seen it, but I think it's actually a pretty notable film in Matt Damon's career, because I remember seeing like the poster or trailer when it came out and being like, you know, I don't think I've ever seen Matt Damon with like a full beard before. And I mean, it seems based off the posters like pretty clearly like not real, not a real beard. But I was looking, and like he said that he has had trouble like growing facial hair. I think really the only movie where he's had like his own facial hair was The Martian, where it was like really patchy because he was like just on Mars, you know, forever stranded. So like, yeah, he couldn't shave, you know, in the world of that
he
movie.
talked about it. He got it like he had like some Italian guys. They like glued it to his face.
Oh my god.
Yeah, he talked about. I think he talked about it with Mark Maron. He was he got, it's like this Italian family that's like been doing movie mustaches and like beards for years. Yeah, and so they glued it on his face.
I'm just imagining like the Alfredo like car tired guy from Cars, but with fake facial hair. Yeah, I don't know. Matt Damon's like interesting in that regard because he is such a like masculine, you know, obviously Jason Bourne, but the fact that like he struggles to grow facial hair, has mostly been clean shaven, and does kind of have this sort of like softer, like pretty boy image, like is pretty interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, he's definitely like, you can tell it's a role that he kind of relished a little bit because he gets to do something very different from, you know, his normal kind of like modern day James Stewart type of thing. And it's a very like, his voice feels a lot deeper, like kind of gruff, and he's very like inexpressive, and it's a very odd performance. And it does almost remind me of like a Clint Eastwood performance, just kind of like very quiet and not you know, signaling a lot of emotion. Just not what you would see from him usually.
Yeah, it was kind of, I want to see it because I've heard like what you're describing the movie as, but it's funny, you know, it was one of those things where they market it almost as like a Bourne movie. You know, I don't think it's like that at all. Like, I don't think there's, you know, and that's what he was talking to Marion about, is he's like, they kind of marketed it a little bit like, you know, this was going to be like a franchise, and this guy was just going to keep showing up in like different European towns saving his daughter. And he's like, no, I mean, that's not what this movie is, you know. So it was kind of weird. Like, it was a little bit of like a I think that possibly was a little bit of it where people kind of went in and was like, oh, hell yeah, it's like Jason Bourne with a beard this time. And it's like, no, it's like a actual drama, like trying to do something.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like if one of the Taken movies just had Liam Neeson get like waylaid and fall in love with some woman in the town where his daughter's been taken, and just briefly forget about his daughter and be like, oh right, I have to go save her.
that sounds way more interesting than like what Taken was. So that's fine with me.
Yeah.
Well, Stillwater, I think it's probably, I'm sure it's like available on demand or whatever now, so you can probably catch it there. Nadine, I'm going to toss it over to you, and you're going to give us a little bit of an update on the wrestling world.
Yeah, I basically have like stopped watching movies, unless you're one of those fine folks who consider wrestling to be cinema. Which
Letterboxd doesn't consider that.
Well, I'm making some progress here because I've been on this very vocal campaign to try to get Letterboxd to officially sanction wrestling pay-per-views and like super cards and special episodes, which is something that has like have been on Letterboxd for a long time.
I remember it. Yeah,
you know, those things have like been, you know, they're on IMDb and TMDB, which is the knockoff IMDb that Letterboxd uses as its database, because they are, you know, usually feature length, 2 to 4 hours long.
Mm-hmm.
They have crews and directors and actors essentially, and I mean are often released as like standalone video releases, and even times there's a long history, even to this day, of wrestling pay-per-views screening theatrically, and so it's something that, you know, it's like it's not officially allowed on Letterboxd, so people will flag it because there are literally like people who spend all of their time flagging things that they don't consider movies that are on Letterboxd. Like I've discovered there are
What a
like 3
pastime.
people specifically who are responsible for taking down all of these like wrestling shows over the past couple months. But
What a
beside the
time.
point, I did submit an official request to the Letterboxd feedback channel to get them to sanction it, because they have allowed things like Doctor Who episodes and On Cinema and Mayor of East Town or whatever the fuck that was, that show that everyone has already forgotten about. And they at first immediately denied it, but then all of these people I stirred up support, and now they have changed it to in consideration. So hopefully maybe I'll be able to finally log things on Letterboxd again, because this is all I'm watching.
What's have they like issued a reasoning why, other than these people are taking it down? Like, what's the reasoning?
Well,
why
they said they their response that they gave me was that it was a sport and that they like weren't ready to add anything to that degree. But it's funny because they have a request to like, oh, like add television officially to Letterboxd, and they were like considering that, and I was like, this is much more. I mean, wrestling is a, you know, very physical, athletic. It is a sport in many ways. WWE considers it sports entertainment. That's the phrase they use instead of wrestling. But it is this very, you know, broadcast oriented product. And so it was just funny because it's just like one of those things where it's like you try to get people into wrestling who are skeptical, and they're like, oh, like, you know, maybe you try to present it as entertainment, and they're like, that's too much of a sport. You try to present it as like a legitimate athletic context, they're like, that's fake. It's, you know, it's like a TV show, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, you know, I think that was also probably part of why people latched on, because they were like, this response is really funny and shows that you guys clearly like haven't really watched wrestling, that you are just like, this is a sport. And there's no debate here, when that's like central to what wrestling is. All that's to say that it is part of why it's taken over my life, in addition to just like, I don't know, I'm doing like a big deep dive historically through the history of wrestling. But it's just a very, very exciting time to be a fan of wrestling, much more than it has been in a long time, I think. And that is because I think the way that I kind of always explain it to people who are like fans of film and not so much of wrestling is like, basically imagine if for like 20 years, you know, you love movies, you went to the movies, and there were only Disney movies. And like maybe there were still like some indie movies or some avant-garde movies, but like you really had to put work into like seeking those out. And if you did, like everybody thinks that you're weird. And it's just like, you know, you tell people, oh, like I love movies, and they're like, oh yeah, like Marvel, right? Like I saw that, like, you know, I saw the new Star Wars, and that's all that they know exists, which is basically, at least in the United States, the predicament of wrestling. People don't really think about it in these terms because they don't really think about wrestling as like an industry, but it is something that has quite literally been monopolized by the WWE. And over the past 20 years, if you are a wrestler, I mean, you know, there are plenty of great indie promotions out there. There are opportunities available to you abroad, but if you want to like actually make a living and sustain yourself, just because it is very precarious, dangerous, ununionized, there's no retirement, you know, you have to become like a star to really like make that work for you. And to become a star, you have to dance with the devil. You have to go to WWE, which is notorious and insanely toxic and abusive and exploitative company, who make a very specific product. And I think the more and more wrestling you see, it becomes quite clear that WWE is basically like, it's Disney movies, you know, it's Saturday morning cartoons. And that's great, and that's fine. And there's been a lot of good stuff that they put out, but that's just one way that that thing can be. And so that denies, you know, so many opportunities to like anybody who doesn't fit in with what they think wrestling is. So anybody, you know, who's not the right body type, anybody who's not the right type of man, anybody who's, not the right race, anybody who's not the right sexuality or whatever. There've been all these, people who have been sidelined over the years just because WWE has controlled wrestling in America since basically 2001, when its main competitors WCW and ECW folded. So all of that context is to say that there is finally something of an alternative AEW, All Elite Wrestling, which has just like, it's been this enormously exciting time because they've been around for a few years, and the sort of basic gist of how they came to be is sort of formed out of a number of prominent indie wrestlers, guys who, many of them not from Japan, American Canadian guys, but who had worked and made their name in Japan and were these like cult darlings, guys like Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks, who basically wanted to be big stars, but they never wanted to work with WWE. They didn't want to subject themselves to that horrible lifestyle and working conditions and becoming a stooge. And so out of the heavens descends this, the one billionaire that I will defend, Tony Khan, who's the son of Shahid Khan, who's the owner of
the Jaguars.
The Jaguars, and some English football club, and I think a few other kind of sports properties.
He's very, very rich.
Yeah, insanely rich. They own that stadium in Jacksonville too. And Tony, his son, had worked for the Jaguars for a long time, and he is like, in the terms of the wrestling world, in the parlance, he is a mark. He is a fucking just fan since childhood. He's up there. You can spot him in the audience of ECW shows in Philadelphia. Like when he was a teen, he was playing like wrestling booking simulators, watching interviews, just a huge, huge wrestling nerd who also has an insane amount of disposable income. So he basically linked up with all of these wrestlers who wanted to kind of produce an alternative. And they started producing they produced a couple of pay-per-views, and then in end of 2019 got a TV deal with TNT, which is pretty significant because TNT used to broadcast WWE's former competitor, WCW, during the era known as the Monday Night Wars in the late 90s, which is really the only time that anybody has like posed a serious challenge to WWE and their kind of dominance. So that kind of like re-triggered this whole kind of feeling over the last 2 years of like, whoa, like there's kind of a war again, there's a competition, there's an alternative. And it's just like been especially really gratifying because recently, because they have, I think, really gone out of their way to like show that like they care about people. I think that's one of the things is like, one of the things that I love about wrestling is that it is ultimately, it's like, it's about collaboration, because you know the outcome, and you and your opponent are working together towards that. You have this sort of fixed, scripted, choreographed, whatever sort of exchange that you're doing. And, maybe there are tense feelings between you, maybe you don't always get along. Maybe there is actual aggression in there, but you're still fundamentally working together, and you're not really trying to hurt each other. You're trying to protect each other. You're trying to make sure you do this safely, and taking kind of each other's livelihoods and lives and bodies into each other's hands. But WWE, as I've said, has been this horrible company to people, and there are people who have died literally because of WWE. There are people who probably owe their like substance abuse and overdoses and just having horrible quality of life into old age and bodies falling apart because they were not provided for or cared for, and they were pushed to their limits. And AEW, I think, is really special because they, something that's really central to them is this idea of like the forbidden door, which is basically like, in the world of WWE, you are exclusive to WWE. You don't go work for other companies. And that, like, the whole history of wrestling before the 80s is all about people going from one company to the other, from one territory, from one part of the world, and exchanging talent. And so WWE, it's like, if they're not giving you work, if they're not putting you on TV, you're fucked. Like, you're just sitting there, you can't go out and do anything. And AEW, first of all, works its workers a lot less, but allows them to go out to other companies, has all of these relationships with other companies, and from New Japan to AAA, which is like the biggest lucha libre company in Mexico, to all of these American indie promotions, and is just like really promoting this just general like love of the product, regardless of like one brand and one company. And they've made a space for like a lot of legends, people like Sting and like who've been around forever, who are kind of Jake the Snake, who are like brought in as sort of like managers and given these sort of creative capacities within the company. But they've also like the big thing recently is they brought CM Punk, who is like one of the kind of defining, I think, WWE stars of the last 10-20 years. And I think somebody who has maybe a little bit of name recognition beyond just like wrestling fans, because he's like, his whole thing, basically his whole gimmick is that he's like, in real life he's straight edge, and so he kind of had this like straight edge punk sort of gimmick and aura, which he a lot of times would play to sort of heel effect and into sort of villainish ends. But he ultimately, like, his whole thing was kind of being the voice of the voiceless, is what he described himself as, and speaking up for the fans and kind of being their voice against this company that is just constantly saying like fuck you to the fans and saying you don't matter, we're gonna like not do what you want and not give you anything that makes you happy and just infuriate you all the time. He really kind of spoke for the fans, but also sort of spoke against the practices of the company, the history. He's also like a really skinnier guy, so he was very much not like a Hulk Hogan or John Cena type, not that body type that you think of when you think of WWE or when you think of a pro wrestler. So he not only like inspired this whole generation that have come since then, but really just like kind of shocked people and sort of brought a new level of like reality and sort of like breaking the fourth wall to wrestling that hadn't really been there before. But he sort of notoriously, like, he left wrestling and it seemed like he was done with it. Like, he had a lot of health issues. He was just really fed up with the industry, with WWE. He didn't want to work for them. And it seemed like he had just completely like lost his love of wrestling. He went to UFC for like 2 seconds. He became like a commentator. It seemed like he was never going to wrestle again. And he returned very recently, within the past month, simply kind of because he sees this place with all this new talent, all these young people who are very excited, who are doing something new. You've got a lot of great women. You've got queer and trans wrestlers in their locker room. You've got just people who are doing different kind of gimmicks and characters and personas than have been done before, who have different body types and different athletic styles. And he's like, oh, like, I want to, I'm this famous person. I'm like really respected. I want to, use myself to put these people over, to work with them, make them better, give them my experience, but also like change this industry and change this culture. And now since then, like, all of these other wrestlers from WWE and all of these just various legends and people have been coming to AEW. And I don't, I hate to like stan a billionaire a little bit. I hate to like stan a corporation, but it's just like very heartening, because it is something where it's like, I mean, again, imagine if movies were just Disney movies, not just from a like, it's boring to watch level, but from a like, think of what that industry is. Think of what that would look like if that was the only way that people could really creatively express themselves and make a living doing it, is through that industry. And it's just, it's nice to have something different. So that's my big sell for AEW. Their recent pay-per-view, All Out, was really, really on another level, like one of the best just wrestling cards I've ever seen. And I'm going this week to their big show in New York at Arthur Ashe Stadium, which is where the US Open is, every year. And there's never been a wrestling show there before. And it's also going to be like the biggest AEW show to date, with like 20,000 people or something. So I don't know, the times are changing, and it's a great time to become a wrestling fan, I think.
Yeah, no, that sounds really cool, just in terms of the description of like how they're, I like the whole like connecting with different, with the different places from around the world. Like, that's kind of like, that's cool to just kind of like to tap into those markets. It's like you're not competing against one another. It's just a way to like, you're all working on the same wavelength, so let's all work on that same wavelength together.
it's like you only have so, I mean, it's, you know, it's like any sport, you know, it's, you're wearing the bodies of your workers down. You can't employ them all the time. You need fresh talent, you need fresh blood. And it also, you know, yeah, it's also, there's kind of an element to it now where it almost feels like, you know, the MCU or something, where it's like, oh, you know, this guy that I know, is a recognizable star like John Moxley or somebody who's like one of AEW's big stars. You know, you start watching like an indie show and you don't know who anybody is on the show, but you know that John Moxley's going to show up, and you're like, you know, learning who all these people are and like finding out all this other talent, all these other worlds you didn't know existed. And it's like I started watching, like keeping up with like Mexican lucha libre and like all of this like indie hardcore deathmatch stuff that I wasn't watching before. And I've been finding all these amazing new wrestlers and new indie talent, and also a lot of new like amazing queer and trans wrestlers. It's kind of just because this like company sort of puts their stars out there, and so if you follow people, it's like you just end up seeing amazing things. You know, like following an actor,
Yeah,
from one thing to another.
Well, we'll have to look for you at the AEW event this weekend.
Yeah, I'll try to wear a shirt that can be spotted.
Awesome. All right, we're gonna take a quick break, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about falling in love with Picklemans with Crossing Delancey after this.
We're gonna cross Delancey.
We're gonna play.
Sorry to go on and on.
No, it was like genuinely it was interesting, like just kind of hearing about like the kind of the counter to like the big you know, the big known thing, because I think that's especially like, you know, I think about a lot of other professional sports now, whether it's the NCAA or the NFL or the MLB or the NBA, and it's like you kind of have like those are the only ways that you can like engage with those specific sports in that, and like most of those are also not great. You know, they're, you know, the NFL is very much
the least,
yeah, the NFL is very much on the same level as the WWE. I mean, it's, you know, people don't leave the NFL and like have good lives. Instead they have like CTE. So, you know, and they've tried to like, you know, it's interesting that like that's succeeding, because you think about, especially like the NFL, they've had, you know, you've had the Arena League, you've had the XFL, you've had like different attempts to like counteract it, and like they've never been able to. So it's kind of cool that you have this guy.
It is a real collision of like, I don't know, very right timing, because there's like this whole, I feel like there's this whole kind of like trope of like once a year some like really rich dude is like, we're going to compete, we're going to go back to the 90s, threaten Vince McMahon. And like I think this was just a collision of like having the right kind of talent, but also having somebody who like has a lot of money, but also like knows wrestling super well. Like there's I don't know, there's just like I've started playing recently this like wrestling booking simulator. And as I've been playing that, I'm like, I can literally see the influence of this like in how they book AEW, because it's much more like kind of sports like, where like rankings matter and like wins and losses actually matter. And you can't just like kind of do a swerve and like give somebody a championship out of nowhere, really. And I'm like, oh, that's in part feels much more like a game, you know, where it's like in booking simulators, you get sort of like points for like, you know, if somebody wins more over time, you know, they get like kind of prestige, they become better. And you're sort of rewarded for that, as opposed to doing a like weekly like TV, you know, anything can happen kind of thing. So it's like interesting to think about that.
Well, and just I think about it like as a baseball fan, you know, like there's so many different leagues in like Latin, like, you know, South America and Mexico and Japan and Korea. Like it's like I'm like, they always are talking about like how to like save the MLB, and I'm like, maybe you should like integrate like some of these international, you know, they have way more fun playing fucking baseball in Korea than they do here. So like, why don't you like, you know, like you should follow them rather than them follow you, you know?
Yeah. Now their biggest star in like years is from Japan, so it would make sense. Yeah.
So no, that's cool. All right.
Should I have stopped recording?
You don't have to. You're well
Okay.
if you want to, or you can run it. It's kind of.
All right.
I get it both ways from
I'm running it then.
people.
I'm just exporting mine really quick,
Okay.
and then I'll be ready.
I got a nice what is it, quote from an interview your buddy Graham did in Filmmaker
yeah.
magazine.
I was gonna shout that out because he
Yeah.
did that
Oh yeah, the
a
Joan.
few years ago.
Joan Micklin Silver. Yeah.
Yeah.
He talked a little bit about Spielberg helping this movie. They were just like, "Yo, Stevie," and he was like, "Oh yeah." He has like this quote. I can't remember if it's in the. Let me see. Yeah, he's like, "Did you go to Warner Brothers?" And she's just like kind of like, "I don't. Who the fuck do I know at Warner Brothers, man?" He's like, "Oh well, I'm Steven Spielberg." I'm like, "Give me a second." You're just like, it's very like he's never had to like go. Oh, I wonder who works over there. It's like, no, you're fucking Steven Spielberg. You just make a call.
Okay, I'm hitting record again. Ready whenever.
All right.
There we go. In 3, 2, 1. And we're back with part 2 of episode 370 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1988's Crossing Delancey, which is directed by Joan Micklin Silver from a script by Susan Sandler based on her play. The film stars Amy Irving, Peter Reigert, Razel Bozic, Joran Crabbe, and Sylvia Miles. 30-something Isabel Izzy Grossman spends her time going from her tiny, solitary West Side apartment to that of her grandmother on the Lower East Side. In between, Izzy builds a glowing reputation at the swank bookstore where she works, while her grandmother plots to find her a romantic match. Izzy is courted by a married, worldly author, Anton, yet can't seem to shake the down-to-earth appeal of Sam, a pickle vendor. The film is based on the off-Broadway play Crossing Delancey, written by Susan Sandler, which opened on April 25th, 1985 at the Jewish Repertory Theater in New York City and closed on May 12th, 1988 after 30 performances. Joan Micklin Silver saw the play and hired Sandler to write a screenplay. According to an article in the September 1988 issue of the Jewish Journal, Micklin Silver's husband, executive producer Raphael Silver, had been unsuccessful in gaining studio interest in the film. However, upon casting actress Amy Irving, her then husband, director Steven Spielberg, was able to bring the film to Terry Semmel's attention at Warner Brothers. Silver talked with Filmmaker magazine in 2018 about securing the funding, saying, quote, "At the time, Amy was married to Steven Spielberg. He was making a movie in Spain, so I went to go and meet Amy, and Spielberg was there. That night, we went out for dinner, and I said, listen, I don't want to be here under false pretenses. I have not been able to raise the money to do this yet, but I'm still working on it, and I'm sure it's going to happen." And Steven said to me, "You mean you've got a script this good and you can't finance it?" I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Have you gone to Warner Brothers?" "No, I don't know anybody at Warner Brothers." He said, "Well, how would you feel if I went to Warner Brothers?" I said, "I would be just delighted." We finished our meal, and Amy said, "I guess we'll make it at Warner Brothers." I said, "Amy, we don't know that. He hasn't even said anything yet." But she, of course, knew that he wanted it to happen. If he wanted it to happen, it would happen. In 1988, the New York Times said, "It's not hard to tell from this and from the humorous depiction of the bookstore crowd snobbery where the film's heart really lies. But what makes Crossing Delancey so appealing is the warm and leisurely way it arrives at its inevitable conclusion. All the different aspects of Izzy's busy, contradiction-filled life are carefully drawn, giving the film a realistic, well-populated feeling and a nicely wry view of the modern world. Yet somehow the director, Joan Micklin Silver, and the writer, Susan Sandler, managed to combine a down-to-earth contemporary outlook with the dreaminess of a fairy tale. In 1988, the Washington Post said, "On the face of it, Delancey begins and ends as the worst kind of sentimental hooey, but that's what kitchen tables are for." And in 1988, Roger Ebert said, "Crossing Delancey makes the mistake of creating characters who are interesting enough to make us care for them and then denying them freedom of speech. The people in this movie have intelligence in their eyes, but their words are defined by the requirements of formula comedy. If this had been a European film, the same plot would have been populated with adults, and the results might have been magical."
Come on, Roger.
Yeah, Raj did not like this movie. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about Crossing Delancey. This is my first time watching it, and I think the thing I kind of wanted to start with was just how, like, this is such a warm and like comforting movie. Like, it's just it kind of just like kind of brings you in for like this very nice hug, and that's like the whole movie. It's just kind of like this wonderful feeling. Anton, for you, what's been your history with this movie, and kind of what stands out about it to you?
Yeah. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. I hadn't seen this movie until I was, after college, or in college. Um, but I would say a lot of for a lot of Jews, this is a movie that you watch growing up.
Mhm.
I guess, I don't know, my parents didn't like it or something. I remember talking to my mom after seeing it and, being very effusive about it. She was like, the movie with the pickle guy, are you kidding me? Um, and, but yeah, it's a really weirdly, I think with a lot of other, like, what you might call Jewish canon classics, like, Yentl, which also has Amy Irving, and Fiddler on the Roof, and the Woody Allen and Mel Brooks movies. They have kind of they're known movies outside of Jewish circles, whereas Crossing Delancey, I feel like has only recently started to have its profile raised a little bit. And I usually will say this is my favorite movie when people ask, just because it's a movie I can feel pretty comfortable recommending to people and thinking that they might enjoy. And it is my favorite movie. But what's so interesting is that either I pretty much only get two responses, which is, oh, I haven't heard of that. That sounds really interesting. Or like, oh, of course, Crossing Delancey. So yeah, it's a really weird movie in terms of the cultural space it takes up. And obviously it's changed a little bit just with Joan Micklin Silver getting a little bit more attention as a filmmaker. And yeah, I really came to it as a cinephile who was discovering her work, and just, yeah, fell in love with it.
It seemed like just kind of doing some cursory research about her. She clearly had between, I think it was Hester Street, and there was the other movie that starred Peter Eigert as well that she did.
Chilly Scenes of Winter.
Yeah, and she just kind of seeing interviews and such with her, like the whole story about like her getting the funding for this or something like that seemed to be a reoccurring theme. Like it was just kind of it seemed like she was making these movies that people responded to relatively well, but it wasn't like responded to enough that, oh, like she would know the person at Warner Brothers who would be, happy to finance this. Like it was kind of one of those, she was very niche, but even more niche than like a Woody Allen or a Mel Brooks, who they could kind of do these smaller movies, but they still had an inroad into this, companies and production companies were financing their stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, like, her first movie, Hester Street, was a pretty big hit for its budget level and the type of movie that it was. And, you have to imagine that if she were a male filmmaker, that probably would have led to more opportunities. But yeah, she did not, she did kind of have to scrape by for most of her career to get funding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I Crossing Delancey and Hester Street both, I think, just nominations, but did get like, I think Crossing Delancey, Amy Irving was nominated for like a Golden Globe, and Carol Kane was nominated for an Oscar for Hester Street. Which, I mean, I think if you look at just like the past like nominations for like actor roles, and a lot of times there are like movies that do get forgotten to time. But it is just, kind of just strange comparatively, like thinking about the types of movies from this period in American cinema that have been canonized and that people really latch onto. It's kind of strange that like her career sort of, it's only been recently that really that it's been sort of looked at as this like full body of work. I mean, I guess that's, like so many filmmakers, you look at her credits and it feels very like project to project. And you know, later on she was doing more like TV movies and stuff. And but I think, you know, to your initial point, Zach, it's just about the warmth, is like, I think this like has it, you know, the most, you know, I feel like this is of her movies is like the most like main, you know, straight up like rom-com, which I think there's a lot of questions that are brought up that, you know, we can get into about like, just, I don't know, I think the sort of canonization of like the romantic comedy, and how that's sort of engaged with in terms of like what a classic is, or like what, you know, a serious movie is, because I feel like so often beyond the kind of like staples, a lot of times those are movies that sort of get left aside, or just aren't really like given the same weight as other certain genres. But I just feel like all of her movies that I've seen have this like, you know, they have this sort of, you know, romantic comic, you know, tenor that's like very much just like of the time, like, you know, feels like it could have been like super, super popular. But they also have just like, all of them are really defined like sense of place and kind of specificity. I mean, Crossing Delancey, you know, like you kind of get it from the title, you know, that it's like literally refers to crossing a street, you know, on the Lower East Side, and it's like very much informed by the sort of like history and culture of the Lower East Side of New York. And Hester Street is as well, and you know, that's like a period piece, so it's even more grounded in that, and in that history. But even like Chilly Scenes of Winter, which is set in like Salt Lake City, I mean, it's not like Salt Lake City is like a character in the movie, but it's called Chilly Seasons of Winter. You know, it's this cold place. It's about this like really contentious, almost like, I don't know, it's a much more comic movie, but the relationship in that movie is almost something like We Won't Grow Old Together, or like, I don't know, Millennium Mambo, or like just one of those like art house dramas where these people are just orbiting and like crashing into each other. You know, you have this sort of very like Woody Allen-esque guy who's really just despondent over this woman, but you know, like you're not really supposed to like sympathize or like identify with him in the way that you are in like Annie Hall. I think, you know, it's not really like a genuine pity party for this guy. It's like, no, this guy is like crossing boundaries and being kind of creepy, and you have to sort of wrestle with that discomfort of even though it's a really funny movie, and has these sort of very like rom-com moments. And so I think that Crossing Delancey is the most like, maybe again, of I've seen, there's still more of her films I need to see, but I don't know, it's got more of that just sort of I don't know, bright kind of peppy energy. I also feel like it's just a very like, feels like a crisp fall movie to me. But at the same time, there's just like such a richness to it, you know, that sense of place. Like again, like, I mean, even like something like the fact that this is a movie about like a pickle guy, you know, and that's just like, I don't know, that's just like that's so specific to where this movie is set, to the community that it is set within, like, and I just feel like it goes beyond so many movies about New York, just in feeling like very natural without feeling like forced either.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that a lot while watching this. Like, it's the depiction of New York in this movie compared to something like, it's explicitly like a Woody Allen movie, like an Annie Hall or a Manhattan, because in like something like Crossing Delancey, you feel like you actually get a sense of like not only like the world that she lives in, because it gives you like this very like perfect picture of like that intelligentsia, the bookstore, like these authors and these, you know, these academic scholarly people, but it also gives you a picture of like the actual community. You think of like the faces that you see when she's in the restaurants or in the bars or stuff like, I mean, you don't just see the same when you watch a Woody Allen movie, you see the same faces over and over again. Like it's almost like it's being John Malkovich, but it's just like Woody Allen, you know, faces all over the place, and like and people that he kind of sees. And in Crossing Delancey, you see like you see people from all, you see what looks like rich people, you see what looks like poor people, you see black people, you see Jewish people, you see people from all over the place. Like you feel like you're actually like ingrained in a community. I think of like that scene where the woman comes in and starts singing, and like like she's bouncing around to different faces, and you see a bunch of different people like all kind of engaging with this moment. And that was something that really stuck out to me about the movie, is that it's like it really does, to your point, Nadine, it really does like understand like the place it's in more than movies that are kind of adjacent to it about New York. Eitan, is that something that you kind of notice about it?
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that really stood out to me this time is just that it's like the specificity of New York is really in, it's a movie about her moving between two different parts of Manhattan, and they're really, distinct worlds for her. And she literally says that, I think, in a line like to Sam the pickle guy. She says like, I'm from a worlds away, the upper west side as opposed to the lower east side, and it sounds ridiculous, but if you live in New York, you kind of get it. Like they're two different worlds.
Yeah, it's like the Seinfeld episode where
Yes.
Kramer like dates a girl who lives downtown, and it's like a long distance relationship.
Yeah. And yeah, just like the I don't know, that I think that there are a lot of kind of dichotomies that the movie is playing with, but that was one that really stood out to me this time. Just like what it means for her to be from the Lower East Side and then living now on the Upper West, or is it Upper East Side? I think it's the Upper West Side.
I think it's Upper West Side.
Yeah, and the class differences, the as you mentioned, the different like type of people that you see in each area, the different class backgrounds, and that's all kind of part of what the movie's about in terms of her moving between those two worlds, and the way that her two romantic interests represent both of those things.
You think about like the kind of like small, just very like minuscule, minimal moments that the movie has. Like the one I think of is like, there's no real narrative reasoning to have the old women in the self-defense class scene, but it's such a wonderful scene. Like it's such a great scene. You even think about like when Sam is playing it looks like I thought he was playing like handball or whatever.
Yeah, it's handball. Yeah, which
like,
if you go to Delancey now, they still have those courts. And
oh, really?
Yeah.
That's awesome. But like just those kind of small, like it's just, again, it's not instrumental to understanding the plot, but it's just, again, it's like it's constantly setting that like you feel engrossed like in this world, which I think
that's a very Joan Micklin Silver. I feel like that's kind of one of her strength as a director, is that there are a lot of these like little interstitial moments that in other movies might just be kind of perfunctory, and she's kind of able to fill them with so much like life and detail. And I think about Chilly Scenes of Winter. There's this scene that I always comes to my mind whenever I'm describing why I love her movies, and it's just like a scene of the guy and his roommate talking, but it starts off with the roommate throwing matches into like a light fixture, and that kind of like is the structure of the scene, as it keeps cutting back to him throwing matches into the light fixture. And yeah, I mean, yeah, Crossing Delancey is just filled with like any moment that isn't quote unquote plot related, just has so much like interesting detail in it.
And on that note, I'm curious how you all how y'all responded to, because she paints the kind of intelligentsia, the academic people in a very interesting, like, it's not necessarily like, she's not dismissive of them, but I like that she also kind of is kind of commenting and poking a little bit just at the built up facade around it, in a way. It's I think that's kind of interesting, just kind of how she portrays those, especially in that first scene, the people at this book release party, or at the party at the bookstore, the author, the different, like the David Hyde Pierce character and his and people who like work there. Like it's not a dismissive portrayal or going like these are, bad people, but it's a very like she understands who this person is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it. I think part of the movie is just about her. And I think this is a pretty common theme about in movies that are about being Jewish in America, but just her like she has to kind of like code switch in a way depending on where she is, and she's almost like not comfortable in either environment. Like in on the Lower East Side with her grandmother and that whole community, she's kind of she kind of feels a need to distance herself from it. But then on the Upper West Side, she's kind of a little more guarded and a little less herself. And so yeah, I think it's I definitely read the portrayal of the kind of literary community that she's in less as like a criticism of that and more of just like something that's tied into how her character is struggling with her identity. And I mean, of course, the author, what's his name, Anton, whatever it is, he comes off pretty poorly. But I think
well, you have him, and you have like the Rosemary Harris character who kind of comes in. She has that the one scene where they're all there in the room, and she's just kind of like battering off stories, and she's this very like well known, like respected literary person, and it's funny like how how Izzy and I think Sam's in that scene as well, like how they're responding to just her kind of pontificating for a while.
Yeah, and the little detail of Sam like sitting down and the shoe getting in his face is so perfect. In terms of just like showing his discomfort in the environment in a way that's very just like immediate and almost like too obvious, but it works really well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like I don't know, a movie that I feel like is a point of comparison, but it's also something that I just feel like it's an easy example to think of because it's a romantic comedy that's also about bookstores. But I don't know, you compare it to something like You've Got Mail, which I feel like, I mean, I like that movie, I like Nora Ephron, but it is just, everything about it is just much more like rigid and kind of clear cut. It feels a little bit more invested in like very conventional, like men do this, women do this, sort of like gender battle of the sexes kind of comedy. And it is like a New York movie, but I feel like this sort of like the sort of conflict in that movie of like the big Barnes and Noble like bookstore, the corporate bookstore versus the small little mom and pop, or I guess just Mac Ryan shop. It's like that could really be like anywhere. You could transplant that, and it's not
be in Chicago, LA.
It's not really about like ultimately like a cultural difference or like a neighborhood difference or a real class difference even. It's just about like, oh, one of these people is like fast paced and business all the time, and one of them loves creativity and expression. It's like more of these like I don't know, it's just these sort of like universal sort of just like emotions, or I don't know, it just something about it is a little bit more generic, whereas everything about Crossing Delancey, in terms of like, I think it's it's portraits of this sort of upper class intelligentsia or whatever, and its depiction of like the Jewish community on the Lower East Side. Like, just everything about it is, again, like more specific, but also feels, and just like something about that allows it to like feel more open. I don't know. It's like you would think that like
Yeah.
being very invested in a sense of place would like, you know, it would be like really, you know, I don't know, bound to like verisimilitude or like trying to like capture life as it really is, which like I think it does emotionally, but it just sort of lets everything like exist a little bit more, as opposed to sort of like scripting it into like a conflict or you know, a genre. Even like, even though it is very transparently a rom-com, like I think it's still like, I don't know, it like exists
Yeah.
outside of its conflict. It's not just this like, will she, you know, get with the pickle guy? Like, will she give in to the pressure to find anyone? You know, what will she do? Like, it's like about that, but it's more about this sort of like character existing in these different spaces, I feel like, than like a conflict, you know.
I also thought of You've Got Mail, which is funny that you mentioned that. But I would say the other movie that came to mind besides You've Got Mail, and which I think maybe might, you know, tie into what you're talking about, is The Heartbreak Kid, because another, you know, Jewish canon classic. But what I realized is that this movie is a like almost exact flip of that movie, because the love triangle that is, you know, the man is in the center, and then there are the two women who represent, you know, the Jewish world and the secular world. And here it's not only is it flipped so that, you know, it's a woman and two men, but it's also flipped where she feels she's kind of like initially tied to the secular world, and then is like slowly seduced by the Jewish world, which obviously is kind of the opposite of what happens in The Heartbreak Kid. But the other thing I was thinking about in relation to The Heartbreak Kid, and you know, The Heartbreak Kid is one of my favorite movies, so this is not a criticism of it.
Yeah.
But you know, Jeannie Berlin's character in that is very clearly like representing a certain archetype of like, you know, Jewish lack of, you know, culturation. Whereas I think in Crossing Delancey, like these characters represent these things, but they also like have a life outside of that. And that's kind of, you know, Sam, the pickle man, you know, says that to Isabella, where he's, you know, in a moment where he's kind of fighting with her. He says like, something like, you think of me, like you think that my background is all that I am, or something, or you think that my, you know, me being a pickle guy on the Lower East Side is all that I am, and that I don't have a life outside of that.
Yeah.
And I think that all of these characters, like, they exist as people at the same time that, you know, this whole kind of drama is, you know, tying into these, you know, kind of cultural issues and, you know, illustrating them.
Well, I think that the characters are really, all the characters involved are really kind of given this definition and this humanity, you know, like to add to your point. I think one of the most like subtly beautiful moments of the movie, and I forgot the character's name, but it's the marriage, the matchmaker woman. And she kind of does have, she's a little bit painted like in this somewhat stereotypical light, and because she just kind of, you know, rolls in the scenes and just kind of, you know, chews up the scenery. But she has that moment late in the film where she's kind of patting herself on the back for getting Izzy and Sam kind of, you know, set up, and she's like, you know, there's just sometimes where I just feel like, you know, I'm actually doing something in the world, you know, like I found my place in the world. And it's like this kind of throwaway, like you know, it's really a throwaway line, but you know, it comes after you kind of learn about like she had, you know, she was married and her husband committed suicide, and she kind of has like this, and so even though you've kind of gotten used to her as kind of coming into these scenes and like having this presence, like you also have like that small line there where you're like, yeah, like she's a person, like she's a real, like she just really is. She's also is like existing on this other different plane.
Yeah, and it's incredible that her husband's suicide is brought up in a joking context where the grandmother suggests that he committed suicide because of like the way that the loud way that she eats. And the matchmaker kind of says, well, he never told me why he did it. I don't know, something about that felt very where like it could be making fun of her, but then she kind of throws it back at her and is like able to take the humor a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, I don't know, bringing up the Heartbreak Kid is interesting because it just makes me think like those, I mean, the two female characters in that movie do basically just like exist as basically like externalizations of Charles Grodin's sort of like conflict, and as much as I love that movie, still don't feel like like you can't really imagine like their life and worlds necessarily outside of that. Whereas I feel like everybody in this movie, and I think this is true of all of the Joan Micklin Silver movies I've seen, is like you can imagine these people just sort of like living their lives and having an interior life outside of the world of the movie. And now I'm just like envisioning like a horrible, like really like hammy Hollywood version of this where like the pickle guy is like Seth Rogen from An American Pickle or whatever that movie is. And it's just like, both a punchline, but also like, just a sort of symbol of like what she's going through. Like Sam is a like very real character, and like and like the fact that he's a pickle guy, like, it is sort of central to like what these two guys represent to her and everything, but it's not, I don't know, that's just like, it's like not, there are not many movies about pickle men, so it feels like something that could, just very easily could lend itself to being that kind of like, this is like a stock character, or this is like a symbol and not a human being who is being impacted by the actions of the protagonist.
Well, I think that's also like a testament to like the work of Peter Riegert in this movie, because I mean, I really enjoyed him a lot. Like he's just fantastic in this. I mean, the other one that I mean, I've seen him in a number of things. He's popped up in TV, a bunch, but the other movie that I just really like him in, because he just kind of just has this really interesting kind of presence on screen, is the Bill Forsyth movie Local Hero. Because he's never like trying to like win the scene or like own the scene. He's just kind of there, and I just like how he's very reactive. Like he just, like the way he kind of just he's there and he reacts to things. It's just very, I don't know. I think he does the same thing in Local Hero. I mean, he's up against at times Burt Lancaster and other personalities like throughout that film, but he's always just there. He's always there. He's always steady, and he's always very charming, and he's very much the same way here, which I think plays into that. We were talking about how this is like a rom-com, and I kind of wanted to like wrap up the discussion talking a little bit more about rom-coms, and going back to a point, Nadine, that you made earlier, is why we really don't like give those much value. It's constantly, those are constantly movies that are kind of either kind of tossed to the side, or they're never looked at as like, this is an important real big movie. And I feel like this is another perfect case of like, this is it's a fantastic movie, but it's probably put to the side because it's like, oh yeah, but it's just kind of a rom-com, it's just kind of a toss away rom-com. And I'm just kind of curious for y'all's thoughts on like why as people watching movies, rom-coms are this genre that's kind of just pushed aside as like, that's not a quote unquote important movie because it's that type of genre.
Yeah, well, it takes me back to the Ebert quote that you read, which I found so odd because of what we were talking about, that he sees this as being, that the characters are being forced into a formula. And I think what's interesting about the movie is that it's really like it's like just before when rom-coms really kind of like took on this, they were kind of reborn as a genre with like Nora Ephron and
I was going to
Nancy
say
Myers and
When Harry Met Sally. When Harry Met Sally comes out the next year.
Yeah, the next year, exactly. And
yeah, like when they become a shelf on the video store,
Yeah,
really
exactly,
like...
exactly. And I feel like if you were to watch, I mean, I'm not going to speak for Ebert, but I think if somebody were to watch this movie after those, I feel like they would feel like this is much less formulaic.
Yeah.
And that's not even a criticism of those movies. I love a lot of them. But it's interesting to see it in that context because it feels to me like almost a proto rom-com that also has its foot in another kind of genre, which is like, I mean, you can sort of tell it's based on a play. It's very, the dialogue is really can be very literary and beautiful, and yeah, it's interesting to me how this can be read as a rom-com, and I think others might watch it and almost not even think of it that way because it doesn't necessarily have a lot of the markers of like your classic 90s rom-com.
Well, and it's also, just thinking about like our ballot for this. I think we had this one, we had When Harry Met Sally, and we also had Bull Durham. So like those are three like very, very, or at least especially When Harry Met Sally and Bull Durham, very well known, like kind of the popular commercial rom-coms of that era. And like this one, again, to your point, like it does feel much more genuine than both. And again, not a slight. I like both of those movies, but this seems more genuine than both of those.
Yeah, I think I think it's partly like the fact that maybe this movie is like seen how it is just because of like when Joan Micklin Silver was working. Like I think if she was somebody who was like of a later generation, like not that a filmmaker like Nicole Holofcener like hasn't had a difficult time making work over her career, but I think she's just been like taken as an artist kind of from the jump, and people are like, oh, she has these movies that are comedies. They are romantic comedies essentially, but they're more of these like indie, like Sundance kind of character dramas. They're treated as sort of their own thing, and I feel like Joan would have like probably been more in that sort of category had she started making stuff at a later time, but with somebody who still really had to sort of like try to fit within the system. And I think mentioning like Local Hero and Bill Forsyth is really interesting because I feel like as much as with sort of like the sort of just rom-com tendency that this sort of predates a little bit, I feel like I don't know exactly. I feel like there may be other filmmakers too who are like this, but and I don't really have a clear kind of theory of this, but I feel like there's something there about filmmakers of like the 80s or like late 70s, 80s, sort of people who maybe kind of like started making stuff in the kind of end of New Hollywood and continued into the new era. Like I think her and I don't know, somebody like Bill Forsyth, maybe a little bit, his movies have a little bit of what I'm kind of thinking of, and or like Alan Rudolph or like somebody like that, who make these very character focused movies, but just because like Hollywood had changed and there wasn't like quite the like auteur freedom, did have to try to like fit these movies into a little bit more of a pop commercial genre package, whether that be romantic comedy or like thriller or like a more awards kind of drama. I don't I maybe
and they were also
like
I was just gonna say they were also like before Jim Jarmusch and Spike
yeah
Lee, and so they didn't have that infrastructure either.
yeah exactly. Like I even think somebody like, even from kind of earlier in his career, like I feel like somebody like Clint Eastwood, is like it's just the fact that like he is a star, that he's sort of been able to make movies in the way he has. I think if he wasn't like an actor and had just been like a director, he probably would have been more somebody like this almost, who like is sort of like trying to, or even, you know, something like Stillwater, where it's like these sort of, how are you selling this kind of movie that you want to use as a study of a character or a place? You know, what's the hook that you're kind of adding to it to like make it sellable?
And let's be honest also, like there's a 0% chance, like if they tried to make this today, it wouldn't have been a movie, it would have been a like 6-episode a series. Like I don't think there's any way she would have made this as a movie. And even 5 years ago, it would have had to been some random ass series on Netflix or Hulu or something, because I don't see them giving 90 minutes of this thing. Like it would have had to have been some 6, 7, 8 part series that kind of, I would watch 8 hours of of just like Crossing Delancey world of just like, but at the same time, like there's something also about the way that this movie is contained, going back to like the kind of the genre conventions of rom-coms. This one's interesting because it doesn't really give you, it gives you they got together in the end, but it doesn't really give you kind of like that fanfare. There's still honestly an opportunity that they don't get together. I mean, more likely than not they're together, but at the same time, it also kind of it more just kind of folds into this, like they're folded back into life. It's not like they're folded into this fairy tale.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know, there's something maybe about to be said about just like the like link to like theater, and to like, I don't know, just to like, I feel like that is something maybe that's also been sort of like lost over time, is just like people who are I don't know, filmmakers, directors who kind of come from that like theatrical mindset of like working with actors and making a character piece. Like there is still that, but I don't know, it's just something about like thinking about a sort of character piece on this level, or like what sort of that means in like today's sort of drama indie film world. I don't know, like it just feels very different. Like it feels like really there's something about like in a, a lot of times I feel like I think of, if something feels theatrical or play like, that's like a bad thing. But I think in a good way, this movie feels like a play in that it is fundamentally like a space where people just kind of exist. And I feel like so many like character focused movies now it's like about the characters, but it's not really about the place, if you know what I mean. Like it's not a fully realized world, really. And I think that's just something that pushes this like and makes it so unique.
And I could honestly probably go we could go like another 25 minutes like on, because I agree with you, and I think it ties into what you were talking about earlier today on Twitter related to the Macbeth movie and A24 movies.
Yes.
But I'll save the audience that long discussion. But I would just say I agree with you, and I could make a case for it.
I will just say on that subject though that I was literally thinking the same thing, because I think that if it was my thinking was, if it was made today, even if it was made as a movie as opposed to a series, there's something about the way that Joan Micklin Silver moves the camera that you just don't really see in filmmaking today. Like it's just like very intuitive and very elegant and very like just very intelligent, without calling attention to itself. And there are some beautiful like stationary compositions, but that's something that I really associate with her work in general. And then in this movie, there are so many great examples of just like ways that she's directing your attention by moving the camera just within a shot. And I don't know, that's something that just feels like it's disappeared a little bit,
No, I mean, again, like you can kind of get into like the one perfect shotification of like how you assess how a movie looks, and that subtlety gets lost because it's not what you're saying. Like it's not flashy. It's not like it's gonna stand out to you that you could like pull that part and like use it to share on social media. It's more just, it feels natural for the place and like, again, like what she's trying to present. And so again, so like what we were talking about at the beginning, like in terms of creating this community, like you think of the scene when the woman is singing in the restaurant and how she moves from not only the woman but also to Izzy and all the different people in there, the people working. You feel very much in that place. You don't feel like you're watching. You
Mhm.
feel like you're a person participating in that area.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I mean, I don't know how you all watched it, but unfortunately, Crossing Delancey's, it's available for rental in different on-demand places, but it's not really streaming anywhere. So I guess we're gonna, as always, say go check your local library if you would like to watch it. But high recommend on that.
Yeah. It was, I think, for a moment on Criterion Channel. So hopefully, a lot of things kind of shuffle on and off of there. So hopefully
Well,
it'll be back at some point.
we talked about, it's New York qualities, and they have this whole big,
Yeah.
big
Well,
fart New York thing on there, and they
that's
don't have it.
how I saw. I think Aton, you too. There was a series at the Quad Cinema here in New York of like the New York Woman of like 30 films from like I mean from all like decades, but there were a lot of kind of from the 70s to the 90s, I felt like, which was sort of quad programming at that time, a lot of it. And that's how I saw this movie. Was in that series, and yeah, and so just like having that New Yorkness kind of foregrounded and like seeing it in New York, just I mean, yeah, it's one of the great, to me, one of the great New York movies speaking as a transplant.
Well, I believe that'll wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter and Instagram at handle @Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we put all the movies, and unfortunately not the wrestling that we talked about in this episode, because we'll figure that out at some point. Next week we're gonna be real quick, patreon.com/Cinematary. Thank you to our patrons, Cam, Chad Newsom, Christina Daughtry, Corey Willingham, Harry Eskin, Candace Sisson, Ron Hayes, Tyler Chandler, Whitney Rio Ross. We very much appreciate your patronage. Next week we're going to be wrapping up our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1989's A City of Sadness, which that just sets me up for some joy. But thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week. All right.
Very nice.
I'm gonna switch the stupid YouTube off.